One of the jobs of legal services lawyers is to challenge illegal laws and to challenge illegal administrative decisions that adversely affect the poor, to try to bring about some change for the poor people that really means something.
The year is 1969. Cruz Reynozo heads one of the nation's best anti-poverty programs. Reynozo is in a tight spot. On one side, his old friend, Cesar Chavez, demands that he support the movement to unionize farm workers. On the other side, Ronald Reagan, California's popular governor, attacks him as a liberal activist and threatens to cancel the program's funding. The legal services of over 1 million of our nation's poorest citizens and their right to decent housing, health care, and education hang in the balance. The son of farm workers, Cruz Reynozo walked a path where few had gone before. He was a champion of the rural poor, helping them better their lives. He was a trailblazer in his profession, helping many of humble origins attain positions of respect and power. As he advanced, he often found himself in the crosshairs of controversy. Yet guided by a strong moral compass, he was determined to enforce the guarantees of the Constitution for all. Throughout his career as a lawyer, California Supreme Court Justice and counselor on the national stage, Cruz Reynozo never forgot where he came from or on whose behalf he was fighting.
He's as gentle a human being as you can find, and yet he's as revolutionary a human being as you can find. Somebody who really wants to change the world.
Hello, we're here with the daily aspect ratio during the 33rd Mill Valley Film Festival. And we're here with a very special two people. One's a little bit more special than the other, you know, if you don't mind.
I'll concede that.
And one is the Cruz, the subject of Abby Ginzberg's film, Abby being the director, and this Cruz Reynozo is here. And I'm very honored to have you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. And I'm going to begin with a quote that's on my email, and on the bottom of my email, that I think somewhat, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, somewhat sums up a bit of your attitude towards life that I've figured out, and it's from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It's, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility.
I think that's true. Even folk that I disagree with socially or politically, you look at their lives and they've done good things. I've read, for example, about the slave days in the South and how many slaveholders were really very kind to their slaves. Or George Washington, who had a couple of hundred slaves and really was a losing proposition for him economically, but he kept them because about 100 of them were old or children, and he felt a responsibility for them. So yet we think a slaveholder must be a terrible person, and yet he was doing it really on behalf of his slaves. So anytime you look at an individual and you look enough, you'll find some elements of kindness, some elements of bravery, some elements of things that you can admire. I think that's true.
And I think you've lived your life that way. Would you agree, Abby?
I would, and I think Cruz sort of said earlier after the screening of the film that, you know, part of his job has been to figure out, you know, what battle he's fighting and on whose behalf he's fighting it, and therefore to adopt a strategy that's appropriate to that particular battle. And I think one of his incredible gifts is sort of being able to figure that out so that, you know, you're not mad all the time. On the other hand, you're mad some of the time. You know, and there are times to be, you know, aggravated, and there are other times to be calm. And I think that one of the things that was interesting for me in the production of the film was to find the footage of you, Cruz, at the time, because A, you were much younger, and so there was a feistiness that just comes with that. And so it was fun for me, you know, to be able to contextualize you back in the late 60s, you know, and for everything that's in the film, there's lots of footage that I didn't put in the film. So I really had a good time going back and looking at this, what I'm talking about, sort of, you know, the chosen temperament, the chosen public temperament, depending on what battle's being fought. And then things changed when you leave the CRLA battle and you move to the court battle, where things were a little bit more restrained, and as you said earlier, because they had to be. I mean, maybe you want to comment on this a little bit.
No, I think that's true. I've been involved in many, many controversies, but I've always approached people with respect. One of my favorite stories has to do with my filing on behalf of a client a discrimination complaint because the registrar was refusing to deputize any Mexican Americans to go door to door to register people to vote, and when the then Fair Employment Practices Commission representative went to see him, he said, "I know who's behind this." He says, "It's that gentleman rabble-rouser, Cruz Reynozo," because I always tried to treat people with respect, and yet he obviously didn't like what I was doing. But then the client for whom I filed won the case because he says, "To prove that I don't discriminate against anybody, I'll appoint anybody the Hector wants me to appoint." But I don't think that it's that you have to be mean-spirited or you have to be loud and vociferous in your opposition. You just have to make your statement, and if your statement is correct and clear enough, it's a strong statement. Mm-hmm. You know, you don't have to shout it. So I think that's the way that I've tried to live my life. Right now, I'm involved with a private commission where we're investigating the killing of a young farm worker, and the DA has had some unkind things to say about us because we're obviously investigating what he's done too. But I haven't felt that we need to respond. Our report will be a responding of
your response.
Yeah.
Abby, how you yourself are a lawyer, and you're not going to refute that.
No, certainly not on camera.
And not after all the money you spent on law school. And your previous film was about a very important lawyer and judge. And how did you come across, not come across Cruz Reynozo? I mean, you have to come across Cruz Reynozo if you're looking at anything in California. But how did you come across the story, and why did it touch you?
Like my previous film about Judge Thilton Henderson, you know, I knew enough. Okay, so what was I looking for in choosing both Judge Henderson and Justice Reynoso? You know, I'm looking for people who are both my personal heroes, who have a level of personal integrity that I feel like may not be manifested all around us anymore, and whose life stories kind of intersect with interesting moments either in American or legal history in a way that permits me to, you know, maybe tell new generations about something they know nothing about. Yeah. So for me, because I had been a lawyer at the point where Justice Reynoso and the other two justices were recalled from the California Supreme Court, and I was still hot under the collar about that, you know, some 24 years later. It's a story I've always wanted to tell, and I also thought that within Cruz's personal life and his personal struggles was, you know, a very important story of what it takes to, you know, kind of commit yourself to get educated and to a life of essentially public service. And I felt like if I could do the film right, what I would be offering the audience is the story of somebody that they may very well have only heard of briefly and not known sort of what Cruz was up against in his life to get where he did. And I would get to say something about some things that I really cared about, like legal services for the rural poor and how important that is, the importance of the independence of the judiciary, and what a travesty I thought the 2000 election was. So for me, I have some interest in some of what those historical moments are that the individual's life intersects with, and some faith that I'd be able to find the footage and find the right people to talk to me to flesh out the individual story. And I would say that my instincts on both these human beings has been pretty good, because I think their names were not household words. They're still probably not, but a lot more people have heard of them and have seen their stories, and hopefully, like me, are inspired by them. So I'm looking for a story that inspires me, and therefore that I think I can bring out to the public and use to inspire others.
Have you got a trilogy?
I do, actually.
You do?
I do. I have a third one. I haven't done much about it, but I have a third Judge story.
Can we get a scoop? Or?
I think we're not going to do that on TV, but I do have one more Judge story in me.
Great.
Well, there are actually a lot of people, when you look at our society and in history, of folk like me who really have devoted their lives to what nowadays is called social justice. But it's really bringing our community life, including the nation's life, a little bit closer to its ideals, because we have these great ideals, but the ideals mean little unless you can fortify them. But yeah, I see people my students in the law school. I just attended a funeral of a person who spent all his life doing that, so I think there are a lot of folk that fit the category I think that I fit in. And sometimes people tell me, well, you've been courageous to do that, but I've never seen myself as being courageous. I just did the things that I thought were the right thing to do, and you keep going, and then hopefully by the end of your time on this earth, you will have helped in a small way create an atmosphere in society that makes society a little bit better. And you do see societies that are a little bit better than another society, and we all have, I think, a role to play in that.
Well, I spent 8 years in kind of backroom brawling Massachusetts politics, and I know how difficult it is to be an idealist within a system. You weren't necessarily in a political system in the sense that you weren't being voted on all the time, but you were nevertheless in a political situation.
Very much so. Very much so.
Were you able to? You obviously have it now, but were you able to during that time always keep your faith in people's human nature?
I have actually. I was interviewed after the three of us were removed from the court, and I was asked, well, what do you think about the court? And I said, I'm still optimistic about it. I think that the longer time goes without a repetition of the types of attacks that the court just went through, the closer the court will get to the great traditions of the California court, which has been a tradition, and I think a proper tradition, of adding some moderation to a democracy. So when a legislature goes too far and passes a law that's unconstitutional and takes away individual rights, the courts are there to say, we don't do that in a democracy. And that had been the tradition of the California court. It got weakened after Rose Bird and the two of us were removed, but even in that time, it's already getting a little bit closer to the tradition that we had traditionally enjoyed in California, and I have a sense that it'll continue to get better. So I'm still optimistic about the courts and about society.
Well, and I know during the time that you were a judge, you were not allowed, you weren't allowed really to make those kind of sweeping political statements.
No, that's right.
But you are now. Does it feel a little bit freeing?
Oh yes, every role that you have has some limitations. As a lawyer, for example, I never ever spoke to the press about a case that was pending that I was handling, because I thought it was up to the judges to decide. I only started speaking to the press when I became a legal services lawyer. And the opposition was always talking to the press, attacking our clients and so on. And I said, wait a minute, you know, this is not fair. So then I remember the first case, it was a First Amendment case, and I started responding to the local prosecutor or county counsel, reminding them that all my clients were doing was exercising the First Amendment rights, you know. And so then I started speaking out for our clients in an ethical way. Sometimes I'm afraid that lawyers speak too sharply in favor of their clients when they should not. For example, a criminal lawyer might say, my client is not guilty. Well, that's not a proper response. It's, my client advises me that he's not guilty. That's a proper response, you know. So you have to be conscious of your role as a judge. I could never speak on matters political. I remember attending a meeting at the local school about Proposition 13, which I thought was a terrible proposition. I still remember the argument in favor of it. The argument was, you know that the state legislature has elevators operated in the Capitol, and all they do is punch the elevator. And if you vote for Proposition 13, we'll get rid of that waste. Well, in fact, they do have those operators, but the operators actually function more like guides because there's so many people there during the session. They'll say, well, Senator so-and-so is this way, go to the 5th floor. They're really very helpful. Incidentally, they're still there. You know? I didn't feel that I could get up and say, wait a minute, you know. So I wasn't involved in politics at all during that time. But then when I left the court, I was active with a group, and even then, the undocumented were being attacked by the Western Regional Director, who was quoted as saying, I think every documented immigrant should be boiled in oil. Well, we attacked him publicly, and then he did call us and apologized and invited us to go talk to some of his agents and so on. But in fact, you never know until you're in a certain situation. After I was not returned to the court, I went up and down the state thanking people for their help. And I would say rather dramatically, I've given up the title of Justice of the Supreme Court for an equally dignified title, that of citizenship, that of citizen. And I didn't realize that the title stays with me traditionally, so I'm still Justice Reynozo, even though I didn't know it.
Yeah, it does stay with you, doesn't it? Yeah.
But then I started being active politically and speaking out. But by that time, I could do that.
This is a little bit out of the realm of the film, but do you mind if I ask you about the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court or of the United States?
Oh,
the money decision.
Yeah. Well, in my view, it's a disgraceful decision, but it's a partisan decision, so it won't be viewed quite like the Gore decision. I said that the Supreme Court had disgraced itself in the Gore decision, and I had predicted that if it issued another such decision, it would lose the confidence of the American people. Mm-hmm. It's taken a long time for the Supreme Court to gain the confidence of the American people, and even though so many people viewed it as I did, as a disgraceful partisan decision with no basis in the law, in my view, nonetheless, the American people could forgive a mistake, but I thought that if they issued a second or third mistake, they would lose that. And the only power, as I've heard several Supreme Court justices say, is the support of the American people for their decisions, mm-hmm. because they decide on the executive right. to enforce their decisions, and the executive would not, then they would be in trouble. The executive, in turn, enforces the decisions whether they agree with it or not, because they feel the American public supports the Supreme Court. So it's very important the Supreme Court keep the respect of the American people. So I was very disappointed when they come down with opinions that I consider really not based on the law.
Yeah, yeah. That's an interesting way of looking at it. I have never thought about it quite that yeah. way, and that the chain of command, really, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've heard both conservative, quote, conservative and liberal judges say that in talks before the American Bar Association and so on, and I think they're correct. Mm-hmm. And, you know, all we have to do is look at history, where President Jackson was out to get rid of Indians, and the Cherokee Nation sued because their land was being invaded, and they won before the Supreme Court. And President Jackson said, well, the Supreme Court has now ruled, let it enforce its own ruling. Well, of course, they couldn't enforce their own ruling, and Jackson continued to ignore it, and was the person behind the Trail of Tears. You know, so without the support of the American people, a decision would be only that. It would not be enforced. So it's absolutely vital that the Supreme Court keep the dignity and keep the support of the American people.
Just before this, we had a screening before about 60 high school age kids, and we were talking a little bit beforehand about the fact that it was a wonderful stretch of color and ethnicity that I actually wasn't expecting.
Yes.
And there were a couple of questions that really touched me, particularly because of that skein of color. That one of them asked you that did you feel as though your light skin had helped you to be able to overcome the stigma of being a Latino in places where you were the odd man out all the time?
Yes, and I had never really thought about that until the last couple of years. And in thinking about it, sad to say in a way, I think it has helped me, because when I'm someplace, except for the sing-song that my voice has, and very often it's confused for an Irish sing-song or whatever. Folk don't know that I'm Latino, so if they're prejudiced, they don't know it. Or, as one lady said when she was saying something bad about Latinos, she said, "Oh, but you're different," you know. And so. I'm sad to say that it probably has helped me. I'm sad to say that only because it means that those who are darker, particularly Indian featured and so on, have prejudice against them. So we see that, for example, with folk who claim that we're being invaded by Mexico and Central America, and every time they show a person from Central America or Mexico, they show a person with very, very strong Indian features. Forgetting that many are Asian Mexicans, they're black Mexicans, they're European Mexicans, they're mestizos, which is 60% of the people are really a mixed blood. I myself am mestizo, but with obviously dominant European blood. But color matters in our society, and I guess color has always mattered since the Europeans started spreading themselves throughout the world, very often in an economically and politically superior position to their Asian or American or African countries, and so very often whiteness was viewed as something superior. And that's, even though that started several hundred years ago, it's still with us very much, I'm sorry to say.
I always loved my son-in-law is Mexican, Yaqui Indian, and he and his mother and his brother went up north to Seattle area at one point, and he was in school, and the kids said to him, "Wow, you know, you're from California, so that's why you've got such a suntan," you know. And he said, "No, I come in this color." That was a light, not a light, a lighthearted answer that sort of defanged that whole thing. But, but I know what you mean. And so, Abby, the other thing too that I wanted to ask you about is that it must be really difficult. I mean, we're not talking about ancient history with Cruz, although he and I probably think ourselves as being ancient history sometimes.
Some might be ancient. I got a certificate the other day from the bar for having been a lawyer 50 years. That's half a century.
Right. But you did have to go back into some archives, and was it a difficulty trying to find particularly because you're dealing with somebody who was in kind of in the rough and tumble, and
I mean, the good news is that the CRLA story was a national story.
Yeah.
And so there was national footage that we got, so the NBC archives had it. There was, the answer is you always have to go back and see what you've got, and then that really has an effect on what stories you choose to tell. And
in the sense that if you can't find the material, sometimes you
it's
have
a
to give a
visual
story
medium.
up.
It's
Yeah.
a visual medium. If
Yeah.
you don't have the pictures, you don't have the story.
Yeah.
Cruz has a bunch of great stories that there was. I mean, I would have had to animate them, or I would have had to fake them, or I don't know what I would have done. And those stories ended up dying on the vine because there was no way to show them. And so you're driven in a documentary, in part, not totally, but in part by what footage you have and how that footage helps you construct the story. Yeah. Because if you only had the interviews and no footage, you would not have a story.
Yeah, my feeling of responding to matters of injustice developed early in my life, and I shared some of those stories with Abby. But I was just a kid then, and a teenager, so there's nothing on that.
No one was
and
interested in
none of those
recording
stories
you.
made it to the film, even though they really were formative in terms of my own notions about what a society should be like and how society should not be like, in terms of discrimination against barrios, in terms of segregated schools, though we did get the segregated school there, in terms of how we treated veterans, particularly minority veterans. There are just a lot of incidents that I saw at the police malpractice.
But let me say something about why I mean, I make a sort of strategic decision as to why those stories were not in here, which goes beyond the archival footage. I am not doing a biography.
Yeah.
I am doing something else. I mean, I don't know what you want to call it, but I'm doing a piece of social history.
Yeah.
And because of that, you need enough biography to sort of
Just
have a
a
through
context,
line of who your individual is. You need to understand what motivates your individual, etc. But, you know, for as much as is in the film, there's a huge amount, in fact, much more that's left out. And so when I have to choose to leave out a story, I do it knowing full well that I never intended my film to be the comprehensive biography.
Yeah.
I asked her about that, and she says, you've got to go with what you have in terms of film.
Well, and you know from having spent some time with it that she's the boss.
Yes.
Well, I thank you both for coming here, but I also thank you both, and thank you second time at least for a wonderful, actually a third time for CFI education with you for a wonderful, wonderful film, and thank you for a wonderful, wonderful life.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for a wonderful life, I agree. And thank you for partnering with us.
Yes.
Okay.